Hey, and welcome back to Coding Nuts and Bolts. For today's lesson, we're going to talk about probably one of the most important factors to your success as a developer. Now, in order to kick off this conversation with you, we have to first talk about Ironman. Hey, if you're here, you're coding with Paris. Welcome back to Coding Nuts and Bolts. I put this tutorial together to teach you everything you need to know about coding using the 80-20 principle. That means that we're going to talk about the top 20% of concepts that are going to teach you 80% of what you need to know to start coding as fast as possible. Today's lesson, we're going to talk about setting up your development environment. And so, like I said before, in order to have that conversation, we need to talk about Tony Stark and Iron Man. Do you guys remember Marvel's release of Iron Man and Iron Man 2 in the early 2000s? It was dope. Well, if you don't know, the legendary RDJ, Robert Downey Jr., plays the role of a super genius billionaire scientist Tony Stark, aka Iron Man. In the movie, Tony creates a bunch of really cool technology that we get to see unfold and eventually ended up to be the Iron Man suit that he portrayed in the video. The suit was really cool. In fact, it was probably one of the most important parts to his success as Iron Man, the superhero. But a lot of folks who watch that movie miss something that is arguably more critical to his success as Iron Man, to his success as Tony Stark, than the suit itself. Sounds crazy, but hear me out. What that thing is actually Tony's workshop, his garage, his development environment. You see, the reason why he was able to be so productive was not because he invented the suit, but because he first set up his development environment. Everything he needed to have, his tools, his monitors and screens, his food, his inspiration, those sweet cars, all of that stuff was available for him and arranged in a way that helped make him super productive. It allowed him to be able to create this suit, and the military couldn't even compare to its innovation and style. If Tony's workshop was like my garage or my office, he would not have been able to be as productive as he needed to be. I mean, can you imagine not being able to find the tools that you needed? Now, here's the point. As a coder, like Tony's garage, one of the most important parts to your success is actually having a good, great development environment. I know the garage is a little bit of an over-exaggeration, but I still mean that. The truth is, as a coder, all you need is a laptop in your hand, a desk, somewhere to sit, and a couple of monitors if you can afford that, and your favorite caffeinated beverage. And that's to get started. Let's learn the basics of creating our own Tony's workshop by setting up our development environment for completing the remainder of this tutorial. Okay, before we dive into learning how to create our environments, I need to ask you a huge favor. Like and subscribe to this video, and of course share this channel with anyone who's interested in learning how to code. Let's dive into the content. Let's go ahead and define a development environment. A development environment is your computer and the software you need to write and distribute your finished code. Simple as that. And so when it comes to setting up your development environment, there are three kinds of software that you need. Your first one is a code editor, often referred to as the IDE or the Integrated Development Environment. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means later. The next piece of software or kind of software you need are usually the tools involved with turning your code into what the computer understands, allowing you to review your progress as you're building things, and usually it involves also some tools and things that will help you distribute the code to where you need it to go. A lot of this toolage varies depending on the computer language that you're using and the operating system that you're using. Let's talk about the first piece of software that you'll need, the code editor. A code editor is exactly what you think it is. It's software that you use to type your code. No, it's not Notepad and it's not Notes if you're in a Mac. It's optimized to help you get the job done by providing features like buttons and windows and shortcuts and coloring for the text, and the list goes on. This sort of thing is kind of like Microsoft Word is to writing stories and essays. But of course, never, ever try to write code in Microsoft Word. If you do, you will immediately make enemies. Anyway, code editors are often referred to as integrated development environments. These are specialized code editors that provide things from a coding perspective. Some of them try to make sure you never have to leave the editor screen to use any other tools ever. And it's because they build everything into this one piece of software. You get it in one big download. Now, IDEs are cool, but they come at a little bit of a cost because they are spendy and sometimes they slow down your computer from the number of things that software is trying to do at one time. But it does give you the Tony workshops kind of feel around things. I would just make sure you need one before I would use one. For what we're going to be doing for this tutorial, which is just using JavaScript as a primary language, we're going to use a popular performant free code editor that can be scaled up to an IDE if needed and then back down whenever you need. And that's called Visual Studio Code. Let's go ahead and download Visual Studio Code for our environment. And I will leave the link below, but I'm going to Google it here. Yes, I am on a Mac, but if you are on Windows, you can also download this from Windows as well. So we're going to go ahead and download Visual Studio Code and open it up. Now I can give you a tour of what's going on here in VS Code. So I've opened up the screen and it's giving us some information on some of the things that we can do in VS Code. Again, our Tony's Garage is pretty much driven by this thing. So I would encourage you to check out all the cool things you can do in VS Code outside of our tutorials, but of course I might do tutorials teaching you how to use it. So let's take a tour of VS Code, okay? This code editor has some icons here along the left-hand side of the window. Think of this as kind of like a navigation bar. The first one that I click is actually the File Explorer. And so what this allows you to do, again, without having to leave this code editor, is it allows you to explore files and directories and also create files and directories. So we're going to talk about what that means in a second. This icon allows you to search for text, whether it's in the code that you're working on or not, or across your entire folder or project that you're looking at. This icon is something you'll need when we start talking about source control. Now that might not be in this tutorial, that will be in other tutorials, but we'll come back to source control because it is important. This icon is for running and debugging your code. Again, this is some functionality we may not need to talk about. The other two icons are kind of important as well. So again, this code editor has the ability to scale up to an integrated development environment. And the way it does it is through a concept called plugins. These are things that pieces of code and functionality that you can download and plug into your editor to do cool stuff. We aren't not going to talk about plugins today, but just know that if you download this editor, some plugins, the ones that have blue check marks, means they are already implemented. Some of these are done by default. Some of them are ones that I downloaded. Some of these are ones that I downloaded to kind of help my environment. This one right here specifically is a styling plugin. You know, maybe I'll do a tutorial kind of talking about Visual Studio Code a little bit more and some of the things that you can do to customize Visual Studio Code to be a cool working environment for you. We will skip this last icon. This window right here, what we're looking at, if I take everything out, this window is a window specific to being for your code editor. What we'll do is we'll start working on some code to give you some ideas of that. Let's go ahead and create our own folder and we'll call it, click new folder, we'll call it Coding with Paris 1. Okay. And click open. What this will do is this will open Visual Studio Code to that particular folder here in the file navigator, so it's open for you, and then we can start adding code to this folder. It's good to organize your things in folders. Now that we've created our first folder, let's create our first file. So the way you do that is you make sure that this folder is highlighted and you click the folder button. I'm going to create a folder called Lesson 1. Underneath this folder, we're going to create our first file. And you can do this by first clicking on the folder, clicking on the file icon, and typing hello world.js. Now make sure you put the extension .js at the end of this file, because that is actually an indication to the computer that this is a JavaScript-based code file. If you don't do that, you might end up with some consequences later, and it's simply just a matter of going in and changing that extension. This is great. We've created our first project folder and our first code file. We will come back to this in a second, but first let's finish setting up our coding environment. So next, we are going to talk about some of the softwares and tools that you need to develop JavaScript code. So we have our code editor downloaded. Let's go out and get some of the tools we need to build JavaScript code. So let's download what we need for developing the JavaScript environment and talk about what that stuff is later. So pick the LTS version for your operating system that will download. Go ahead and follow the instructions for that. And once that is done, we should have what we need for JavaScript. But what is NPM in Node.js? Remember way back at the beginning of this tutorial when we talked about computer languages and how they need software in order for it to be translated into something that the computer understands? Those are the ones and zeros. For the JavaScript computer language, we needed to download this software. In Node.js and NPM, which is Node Package Manager, are tools that can be used to compile your JavaScript to something that the computer understands. It also provides an environment where you can execute your code once it's built. Simply put, it translates the instructions of your code into something the computer understands, and some people refer to that as compiling, and it makes the computer perform those actions. We'll dive into that a little bit later. So now that we have followed the instructions to install Node.js, we should now have most of the tools we need to write JavaScript. So let's go back over to the code editor window, go to Terminal, New Terminal, or you can press those keys here, those combination of keys here. It should open a window at the bottom of your screen here. What this allows you to do is to be able to use a terminal, give commands. So really quickly, a terminal is essentially a way for you to run software that does not have a beautiful window with buttons and things to click, like this code editor, okay? And in most code compilers, most things that are translating the code into something that the computer understands, they are ran from the terminal. Trust me, we're probably going to do more work in the terminal and tutorials in the future, and you will look like a badass if you know how to use the terminal. I'm going to show off a little bit for you today. So, in your terminal, we're going to give it instructions to run Node.js to give us an idea if we install things correctly. So let's go ahead and type the command node and press enter. And here you should see some text showing up at the bottom, and with your Node version, whatever that might be at the time you're looking at the tutorial, might be different from mine, but then you should see an arrow here. So now this is running Node and it is waiting for some instructions. We're going to go ahead and exit out of that by pressing Control-C, and that might vary depending on if you're in Windows or Mac, but follow the instructions. Control-C, Command, or it's either Control-C or Command-C to exit out of that program. Okay? Press clear, and what we're going to do now is work on writing our first piece of code. So up top, if you click on this window here, you should see a blinking cursor. I want you to copy what I'm going to type here. Console.log equals hello world. Click save. If you wrote that, then you've written your first piece of code. Congratulations. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. So basically, this line of code, without getting too deep into the details, is telling your computer to repeat back to you the phrase, "Hello world." And so let's go ahead and get your computer to actually do this. Down in your terminal, again, go ahead and click and you should see a cursor. Let's first see where the terminal is at. So let's type the command pwd. So this lets us know what folder we're in, and we're in Coding with Paris. Okay, so let's go into our lesson 1 folder by typing the command cd. That means call directory, and then lesson 1. Press enter. Case does count. Now if we do the command pwd, you'll see we are now in lesson 1 folder. And pwd stands for print working directory. Now that we're in this folder, we can type the command node, which is referring to the program that we just downloaded to compile and run our JavaScript code. And now we can pass it the name of our file next, right? And voila, the computer prints back the phrase "Hello world." Let's review what we covered today. The first thing we covered was environments. We discussed what they are, why they're conducive to your success by using the Tony Stark example. And we talked about the important things that you need in your environment as a coder. Next, we covered the 3 pieces of software that you need to set up your coding environment. The first one being an IDE, the second one being all the tools and things needed for your specific programming language, and finally, just a little bit of inspiration. That last one is a little bit of a joke, but seriously, have some inspiration with the background or a backdrop. Again, the beauty of having a laptop is that you can take your coding environment with you. Next, we created our coding environment for this tutorial by first going to grab our IDE, which was Visual Studio Code, often referred to as VS Code. And basically, we just covered what we needed to know to get started writing code. But there are so many things. There are vast things that I did not get to cover in this tutorial about VS Code. This code editor can scale up into a full throttle IDE. And it's one of the best editors out there. So I, again, encourage you to get to know it a lot more. An IDE is an integrated development environment. And what that means is that this code editor, it has the ability to do more than just allow you to write code and save files. It has the ability to do all sorts of cool things. So check out the plugin market for Visual Studio Code. I'll probably give a tutorial on some of that stuff at a later time. But when it comes to productivity, the IDE or the code editor probably pulls the cart as far as I'm concerned. You have a good code editor, it brings your productivity up immensely. So that's enough about that. Grabbing Node.js as the runtime and the compiler for our JavaScript. We also talked about the terminal. Finally, we wrap things up by actually writing our first piece of code, the famous Hello World program. Congratulations, you are now a coder. And you set up your first development environment. With that being done, it's time for us to move into the next part of this series, which is starting to learn those nuts and bolts, starting with statements and variables. Let's go.